Welcome and Baruch Ata Adonai Eloheinu Melech HaOlam Asher Kitshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah.
Amen.
And let's go into the share. And we'll go here too. And what we were doing, we were looking at verse 25, where Jacob remained by himself. And then immediately it says, and a man wrestled with him until daybreak. And we discussed yesterday the fact that he was, what did it mean to say levado, by himself? And Rashi mentioned these insignificant jugs that Jacob went back to clean up the campsite, you might say. And we were in the middle of that because I said I believe that we would finish up the Rashi on this because there's more Rashi on this, and then we'll go back and try and finish up the Torah Temimah.
Rabbi, that man was an angel or a divine person. It was an angel. Although I think Jacob was wrestling with his conscience. That's what he was wrestling with. Or he was wrestling with Esau's conscience too. Maybe Esau sent a demon and wrestled with Jacob. I don't know, but it doesn't seem to me that when he was wrestling with something, it was an angel or a divine person. And he didn't know it, but then later on he did.
So I agree with you, Harlan, that we're going to take a look at what Rashi shares with us, the tradition as to what this is about. But I also think you're right. This is a turning point. It's going to be a turning point for Jacob, and that is the name change that's going to happen a little bit.
Jacob was scared because he lied to his father, and he lied to he was just as well like Laban. He was
a cheat.
Yeah. Absolutely. That was on his conscience. Mm-hmm. And he was worried that Esau was coming, and he was wrestling with his conscience, I suppose. I don't know.
Well, I think you're right that possibly he was actually wrestling with himself, wrestling with the realization. But as I said, this is a moment of a really important moment in his life. And this whole little incident is like a change for him. A whole new development. So let's keep going. Let's go into the text itself and see what it says. So, v'ya'avek ish, right? A man wrestled. Menachem Piresh. So this Menachem is one of Rashi's teachers. And whether or not he actually wrote a book, Menachem left some kind of document. It's possible, and it may even be extant, for all I know. But Rashi does cite this from time to time. In this particular case, he's going to cite it to disagree, but regardless. So, Menachem Piresh, vayit afer ish. So he explains it as vayit afer. What does this mean? Milashon avak. It comes from the word afar, meaning avak, dust, or earth. And he says, Shayu ma'alim afar beraglehim, because al yedei na'anu'am, because they were kicking up dust with their feet by means of their movements. So, I don't know, maybe got a dusting. At any rate, that's how Menachem translates this word vayavek. Ve'li so he goes on to say, but in my opinion, shehu lashon vayit kasher, that it actually has to do with tying, with being connected to, right? Kesher, to connect. V'lashon aramihu, and that it's actually Aramaic. It's an Aramaic origin. Batar, here he gives an example. Batar da'aviku be, after he was entangled with him. So this, whether or not this is a quote, it's not, we don't see whatever the source is, but Batar da'aviku be is, this is all Aramaic. So after he or they entangled with them. Avak le mevak. So this is probably again, could be a continuation of this citation that Rashi is sharing with us. And there is the avak le mevak, and again, avak le mevak Aramaic, right? And he totally entangled with him, right?
So mine gives a citation as
Yes.
Sanhedrin 63b.
Thank you. Okay, so it just isn't here, so maybe I will pop it in there. Thank you. Thanks, Lauren. Let me put in the citation here. Right in there. Thank you. Great. And Lashon Aniva, it has the connotation of a loop, fastening with a loop. In other words, it's not a knot, it's a loop. It's something that you can untie. Shekain derech shnayim, because it is the custom or the way for two people, shemit amtzim, that are wrestling with each other, lahapil ish et re'ehu, for the one person to cause the other person to fall over, to drop the other person, shechov ko, because he's hugging him, he's clinging to him, ve'ovko, and again, he's entangling him, bezro'otav, with his arms. Upirshu Razal, and our sages of ancient memory said, Shehu Saro Shel Esav, that this was actually the guardian angel of Esau that he was wrestling with. So at least the traditional understanding of Elohim here is, as Harlan was mentioning, that it's understood as a divine being, not necessarily with God, but with a divine being. And as I thought about this, I went also where Harlan went in terms of who is he really wrestling with, because this is such a change for him, that perhaps this is a realization, a moment of realization for Jacob, because he thinks back on his experiences, and possibly he's meditating on or thinking back on everything that's happened to him since he was forced to leave, and now he's heading back. And what does this all add up to? And it's pretty sad. I mean, a lot of this story is really sad when you look into the various details of it. The person he's in love with winds up not to be his soulmate, his soul, S-O-L-E, mate, but so his soulmate isn't his soulmate, and then she is barren, and it takes a long time, and of course we know that in the future she's going to have a second child and die in childbirth. I mean, how sad, Dayenu, right? In the meantime, Laban tricks him. He has to get his salary, he has to trick Laban back, because he knows what Laban's made out of. But, even having to work things through in that way, dealing with someone who's going to cheat you and figuring out how you're going to, protect yourself. These are not pleasant things to have to deal with in life. And now Laban was going to kill him, right? Both times he's escaping, right? We mentioned this yesterday. And now he's heading on to Esau and doesn't know where things are going to head there. He knows, and he hears that he's coming to meet him, I think with 400 men, if I'm not mistaken. He doesn't have 400 men because he's planning on going to a barbecue somewhere. Or if he's going to skewer anybody, it's going to be Jacob and everything he has. So it's quite possible that at this particular moment, he is really forced into looking into himself and saying, what have I done to deserve this? Go ahead, Harlan.
But God said before to Jacob, you're going to be in the promised land, you're going to multiply by the sand of by sand. In other words, I'm going to bless you, Jacob. I'm going to be with you. Don't worry. Nobody's going to hurt you. And he told him that before. So why was he talking about Esau? Because God's going to protect him anyway.
I can answer that question. Okay. I've got two responses to that, Harlan. Very good points. Very good points. One is that we're going to have a prayer. Jacob basically does three things. He's already done one of them, right? One of them is that Jacob has sent Esau gifts to try to appease him. The second thing is he's going to have a strategy, right? He's going to split his camp so that if one of them gets, in other words, damage control. And the third thing he does is pray. And we'll look at the words of his prayer, and you'll see that he does make reference to that. Now, if God assured him of that, how come he's worried? And the answer is, we have in our tradition, even though God may have blessed you, hachet gorem. That's the phrase that's used, meaning it's not unconditional. God is going to do it. But if you sin, right, if you choose to move away and sin, those blessings aren't going to happen. So Jacob is, again, could well be worried that as he looks back on his life, that would simply reinforce the point that I was making and that you were making before, is that this is a watershed moment for him. So very, very good question, and hopefully the answer is something that is satisfying. That's a good enough answer. So here we go. Let's take a look at. We'll go back into the Torah Temimah here. So we were talking if some beautiful and very interesting Torah Temimah here that about how you possibly could interpret that when it says he was by himself, that it was about these jugs cleaning up the camp. And he tries to go into it and says, in fact, there may even be a certain play of words here, and that's kind of where we left things off. V'hinei b'pasuk kaf gimel, and he says in verse 23, Piresh Rashi, v'hu midrashim, that Rashi explains, and based on midrashim, v'et achad asar yeladav, that when it talks about 11 sons, or it says children, doesn't say sons, doesn't say achad asar banim, it says yeladav, his children. The Dinah hechan haita, you may remember this, right? He says, where was Dinah? Nitna b'teva, so he put her in a box, shelo yitan ba Esau et einav, so that Esau would not cast his eyes upon her. Umevuar de psikale, okay, and so it's clear that he has determined that it's determined the rak Dinah haita chasera az, that only Dinah was missing at that particular time. V'tzarich iyun mi nayin loze, and frankly, he says, one needs to look deeper into where did this come from? This whole business of Dinah being in the box. V'dilma ben echad mehascharim hayachaser. How do we know that it was Dafka Dinah? It doesn't say ben, it says Yeladav. How do we know that it wasn't a different child? Ve'efshar lomar al derech drash, and it's possible one could explain this by means of a drash, al pi ma shekatuv ba'agadot, referring back to what is written in Agadot, in other legends. Tam hadavar, that the reason for this particular interpretation, she nivna Beit HaMikdash. Look at where he's coming from. That the Beit HaMikdash, that the temple, the holy temple, was built bechelko shel Binyamin. That the reason why the temple was built in Benjamin's area, in the land that Benjamin acquired, and he says, "Yein lefanenu perek or bracha, the perek uvein ktefav shachen." Okay, and he says, look ahead in the chapter Zot HaBracha, the Parsha Zot HaBracha at the very end of Deuteronomy. In the verse bepasuk uvein ktefav shachen, it says, and between his shoulders he will rest, he will dwell. And it's referring to a blessing to Benjamin, and that's understood as a reference to the way the temple was built on Mount Moriah. And the reason they give there in those Agadot, mipnei shelo hishtachave le'esav, because he didn't bow down to Esau b'sha'at hapagisha, at the time when they met, right, coming up now. And he says the very simple reason is Shelo haya nolad az od, because at that particular time, very simply, the reason he didn't bow, he wasn't born. He wasn't around. Okay. Ulefize, and using this as a basis, right? Muchach, it points out, it shows the al korchacha, that we have to say kol bnei Yaakov hascharim hayuaz. So from that basis, we can determine that all the sons were there because the land was divided up according to the descendants of each one of the tribes, and the tribes, of course, were defined by the sons of Jacob. So that's how we know it was Dinah and not one of the sons. Mishum de'im lo hachi, because if this is not the case, he just goes on to support his argument. Lama lo nivna beit hamikdash bechelko shel zeh. So why wasn't this the temple built in the place of the one? If one of the sons were in the box, well, then that son that was in the box wouldn't have been bowing down to Esau. So why wouldn't it have been built in that particular son's territory? In that case, the Gamkein, and another reason, lo hishtachaveh. The point is that son wouldn't have bowed down either, if that's the reason that the temple was built in Benjamin's property. Umi dichtiv ve'etachad asar yeladav, all right? And since it does say his 11 children, al korchacha, you have to deduce shahayta chasera Dinah, that Dinah, because it says 11, right? You have to conclude that it was Dinah. So complicated maybe a little bit, maybe convoluted even, but again, he feels we have to, deconstruct exactly how one concludes these things. Umashikatav Rashi, and Rashi wrote in addition, right? Shene'enash Yaakov al shemana et Dinah, that Jacob was punished because he prevented Dinah, he prevented Esau from Esau. He didn't allow Esau to see her. Shema tachsirena lemutav, and he goes on to say, lest she make him improve. In other words, that she refine his character, or and it's interesting. Tachzirenu, she should bring him back to the good way. So that's something, right? That the good way is actually fundamental, and that's why we can talk about straying when we do things that are wrong. Tzarich biur. This also requires some explanation. Heichan matzinu kahai gavna. Where do we find this particular way of doing things? Sheyehe chova al adam. That in fact it is a necessity for a person, limsor et bito l'rasha, that a man is supposed to allow his daughter, right, or to transfer his daughter to a wicked person, shema tachzirena l'mutav, right? That in fact that is something that a person should do, right? Because Jacob was punished for not doing it. So that means that presumably there's an obligation that if there's a wicked person and he loves this man's daughter and they're righteous people, she should be marrying him. V'halo keneged ze yesh chashash, and in fact, to argue with that, there's a possibility shema yachziren nahu l'resha. Maybe he's going to have an influence on her and turn her wicked. Ve'efshar lomar. So it's possible to say, Dubeze lo haya Yaakov misupak, that in fact Jacob had no doubt in his mind that if Dinah married Esau, she would bring Esau to a righteous path. Shehi tachzirenu lemutav, that she should bring Esau back to a good path. Ach mipnei ze gufa, and because of this very reason, lo ratza lahasiya ota lo, he didn't want to have her marry him. Kedei shelo tachzirenu lemutav. In fact, that was the reason that he didn't want her to marry him, because she might have a good influence on him and change his character for the better. Klomar, and what we're saying is, shemisin ato oto, that it was on account of how much he hated him, lo haya rotzeh ze gufa sheyachazor lemutav. That this is precisely that he didn't want her to be able to have that influence, and that Esau should improve his character. And I think that is amazing. It is amazing because there's such a tradition of Esau's wickedness and Jacob's righteousness. And this little piece, right, is saying so much about the nature of that hatred. And we see that hatred, developing in all kinds of different ways and saying, this is punishable. That bearing that kind of hatred and writing off Esau to such a degree is in fact wrong. And I think that's one of the reasons why I wanted to share this Torah Temimah with you, because I think this is a powerful message.
You can almost say that it's because of Jacob that we don't have the Messiah, because had Esau turned good and we wouldn't have had this perpetual enemy, but more unity in the world, and more goodness that could have brought about, the Messiah and Jacob, and it's kind of the way that I tend to look at political divisions anyway. It's never an evil versus an innocent, side.
Right.
There's
Right.
just
that it's not unshaded. There's shading one has to take into account.
Yeah.
And not only that, to look into ourselves, right? I mean, I love to say that I am an expert when it comes to everybody else, right? That finding fault and reasons to dislike or hate or whatever is so natural. And the thing not to do is to look at oneself and say, number one, if I have a bad relationship, are there any elements to my own behavior that are causing this bad relationship? Excuse me, Esau wanted to kill Jacob. Did he have reasons that Jacob might have provided?
Yeah, and that's
It doesn't justify it, but certainly Jacob had something to do with it.
Right, and that's often the case that that so-called enemies were kind of created by us,
Yes, I think so.
and sometimes very directly, and sometimes indirectly, but that we played a part.
Agreed, Lauren. I think that, and your point about the Messiah is really cool. Thank you. It didn't occur to me, but I so appreciate your sharing that. Yes, I agree. But what's the message for us, Lauren? What is the message for us ourselves, right? When we slip into complaining and criticizing everybody else. I think critiques are okay, but you've got to clean yourself first. That's, there's that famous story about, when you go to heaven, they're not going to ask you, why was so-and-so such a bad person, and why was so-and-so such a bad person? And yet we sort of live our lives in this sort of stream of finding fault. And it's so easy. It's so easy. So anyway, let's go on. So you understand now why I felt it was important to share this with you. Vayeh lefi zeh biur halashon b'Rashi. And for this reason, we now have a clarification, right, of Rashi's language. Shema tachzirenu lemutav, lest she bring him back to goodness. Klomar, that is to say, she'al kein lo hisia ota, that there was for this very reason, that it wasn't that might happen, that was the reason, right, that he didn't want her to marry him. Shema tachzirenu lemutav, lest she bring him back to a good path. Uvazeh lo hayachafet, he did not desire this, v'lachen ne'ernash, and for this reason he was in fact punished. So we have some more. Of course, this is a lengthy Torah Temimah, and I think what I'd like to do is stop here, and I'll go over this again and take a look at the rest and see if this is something that we should discuss possibly tomorrow. So I'm going to put the arrow there. Let me see if I can copy the arrow. Here it is. Okay. Take that out. See if I can copy it here. Okay. Right in there. Let's see how this works. If this will work. Yep, there it is. So I'm going to write in there for tomorrow. Thank you. And I'm going to stop the share and stop the recording until tomorrow, God willing.